So I don't know how many of you have heard me speak, heard the story of SIBO and IBS and the microbiome, but new data, new exciting results, and I think you'll be impressed with where we are. But there's more to come after this. Research continues. So one of the things we get confused about in some of these programs is that irritable bowel syndrome. So I'm going to start with IBS and then sort of dovetail it with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. But IBS affects 45 million people in the United States. It really is the number one condition, especially in gastroenterology, and extremely expensive because it's literally such a large population and up to 1 billion people worldwide. So this really is a very important condition of which until recently we didn't know much about it. One of the things that's confusing about irritable bowel syndrome is that even though the Rome criteria were created to define IBS, bloating was never part of it, which is really stunning considering these two studies that are more recent, like literally from last year or 2023. One is showing that in 88,000 people surveyed, bloating was really the most important problem of these patients. And the same with the folks from Rome who devised the criteria for IBS. Bloating really is the most important criteria, or at least important symptom. And yet not much had been done about bloating until sort of some of the SIBO stuff came along. But I want to kind of get something out of the way is that there used to be this notion that IBS was caused by stress or anxiety. And we do this all the time with a lot of conditions. And this is a cute article I found in the New York Times from 1972. And the article quotes, "The stress caused the man's heart attack. He was president of a company and this was very stressful. The doctors told him he had too much adrenaline." And so my point here is when doctors don't know what causes something, they often say it's stress. And we all know now that this CEO or president of the company was probably smoking, probably drinking, probably eating at steakhouses every third night with business, and his cholesterol was through the roof. And now we know that's the cause of the heart disease. We don't tell people to quit their jobs anymore because they have a heart disease and to reduce their stress. But the other thing about IBS that's really kind of shocking, and this was ACG clinical guideline for irritable bowel syndrome and summarizing all the drug therapies that are available. But what's shocking is that we include all these therapies in various areas like psychological, like trying to make the stool more wet with polyethylene glycol, or antispasmodics, antidiarrheals. There would never be a Crohn's guideline where they talk about antidiarrheals. Yes, we'll make the diarrhea of Crohn's better, but they don't talk about it in the guidelines. The guidelines are all about FDA-approved drugs, but IBS is such a mess that they throw in antidiarrheals, antispasmodics, all these different things, and because we haven't understood the causes. So what I want to start with is we now know the cause of about 60% of IBS, and that's based on the science I'm going to show you here. This is a meta-analysis of food poisoning outbreaks. So you ate a bad something when you were traveling abroad, you got sick, and ever since then you have IBS. And this is the study that looks at all those prospective studied outbreaks. And there are 49 studies now. So this is a brand new meta-analysis just from the last few months, and its pool prevalence is 14%. So imagine that 7 of you go on an amazing adventure. All 7 get food poisoning from some stand that you ate food at. 1 of you is going to end up with IBS, 1 in 7. So you're going to end up with IBS for an indefinite period of time. That's what this data suggests. But just putting that stress into the context of this was a study done by the Naval Research Facility in Bethesda, and they looked at the deployment to Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, and these troops were coming back from deployment with IBS at a fairly high rate. And so they wanted to understand, like, well, what's going on? And what they found was you could be seeing people dying or killing people or firing your weapon in combat or war stress. That didn't matter. That was not causing IBS. What was causing IBS, what risk factor they identified was, hey, did you get diarrhea while you were in combat eating that food? Or did you get vomiting from that food? So food poisoning was identified as the risk for IBS. But what I'm trying to say is equally important. This study says that it wasn't the stress. This study says it's not the stress. And I think this is a very important negative finding as well, not just the positive finding of food poisoning. And we think that food poisoning accounts for about 60% of IBS in this mathematical model that was published. But look at the right, just for curiosity. If you're deployed to a combat zone, your chance of ever developing IBS in your entire life from your exposure of just being human and eating at different places, you get IBS within 1 year, that full 1 year deployment. If you're ever going to get IBS, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen already. So that's how much exposure to food poisoning they get in the military, which is unfortunate. Campylobacter is the biggest cause of food poisoning in the US, but all of the bugs can do it. E. coli, Shigella, Salmonella, Campylobacter, the 4 major bacterial players. And so we developed an animal model where we infected rats with Campylobacter, and they got IBS, but they also got SIBO 27% of the time. And then they developed the symptoms of IBS with diarrhea. But we didn't know why they were getting IBS. In our IBS humans, we saw that IBS patients with SIBO, and here we're starting to introduce the concept of SIBO, IBS patients with SIBO, they had a lower migrating motor complex frequency. What is the migrating motor complex? This is the migrating motor complex. So at night, when you are not eating, when your stomach is empty, this beautiful contraction comes through the gut in a peristaltic way, starting at the pylorus, going all the way down to the colon to sweep out debris, junk, pieces of lettuce, etc. This is a very important wave, and it happens once every 90 minutes all night. So you might get 3, 4, 5, depends how long you sleep, and you get these waves. If you don't get these waves, you get bacterial overgrowth, and that was shown on the paper on the left. So these waves are absolutely important, and there's a special cell that drives these waves, and I hope you can see my cursor. These little dots here that are labeled as B, the deep muscular plexus interstitial cells of Cajal. You don't need to remember that, but these characters are what shoots the electrical impulse to get to make that wave happen. So in our animals, we saw these cells in the normal rats, very beautifully populated. In the Campylobacter infected rats, less populated, but the Campylobacter rats who got overgrowth, you could hardly find them. So we think that Campylobacter is damaging these nerves, and we now know possibly why, and resulting in a lack of cleaning waves, and that leads to bacterial overgrowth, and that's why overgrowth is so common in IBS as a cause. And so we think SIBO is the cause of about 60% of IBS-D. But it does this through molecular mimicry. So molecular mimicry is when one of the leading mechanisms by which infectious or chemical agents can induce autoimmunity, and basically it's confusing a foreign substance as you. And I'll show you how that works. Because we found out that all of the major bacteria that cause food poisoning have a common toxin in common. It's called CDTB. They don't have any other toxin in common apart from this that we know of. So we did this very elaborate paper, probably one of the most important papers that we've ever done, showing that the mimicry of CDTB is to U, the protein vinculin. And this protein vinculin is critical for the nerves, in particular the nerves that make that cleaning wave, to interconnect like wires connecting to switches in the wall. And so you get food poisoning and you get exposed to this toxin, CDTB, you form antibodies, but one of these antibodies looks like vinculin, and that's mimicry. And therefore you get this autoimmunity that goes in perpetuity. You don't have CDTB anymore, you get rid of the infection, but you still have U, which is vinculin. And vinculin is at the end of these green filaments. This little red part, the red staining is vinculin, and that's here, you can see it nicely. And so it acts like a little motor at the end of these filaments, and it makes the cells reach out. You can see them reaching out, they grab onto each other, and they're wired together. And the wiring is very important for nerves. This is the first study we did using these antibodies in humans. Can we use these antibodies to say, hey, you had food poisoning and you have IBS because these antibodies are positive in you? And we could. For IBS, you can see D and IBS-M mixed. So these were higher than this constipation and of course healthies. So you can use it in D and mixed. It's a little bit unclear for constipation because it's not as common and closer to controls, but it is still higher. So it depends on what you hear from the history of the patient. But then we developed a second generation test called IBSsmart, because this CDTB and the vinculin are unstable proteins, and there's a way to stabilize them for the ELISA test. And by doing so, we got even a greater separation and a much better post-test probability. So I'll show you that. But this is one of the studies we did to validate that. But it's really important more to look at this. So this is how the test performs. So the post-test probability of this, if either are positive or both are positive, are slightly different. So both are positive, you have post-infectious, you have IBS. But look at the sensitivity for general IBS. This is very important. People will say, well, the specificity of this test is really good, but the sensitivity, it's not so great. But remember, we are not diagnosing IBS. We are diagnosing post-infection IBS. So out of 100 IBS patients, only 60 are food poisoning related, and we're finding 56%. So we're essentially finding 56 of the 60, which is really super accurate. So you can't focus on sensitivity when the 100 patients, not all of them came from food poisoning. But what this does by the specificity, if you're positive, move on, you have IBS. And look at the accuracy of this test versus anything else that's ever been developed for IBS. And you can see that it is within what we call post-test probability, medical certainty range, which is over 80%. And the second generation test is the best test ever for irritable bowel syndrome. So it's easy to do now. You don't even have to do phlebotomy. You can do this in your office. Patient could do it at home if you order it for them. They put it on their arm, press the button. The blood comes in the tube in the bottom. They cap it, throw it in the box, and send it room temperature back to the lab. So very easy to do. But I want to take it one step further as we transition to the SIBO part of this presentation. And that is that we actually gave rats the toxin, the CDTB toxin, and they develop antibodies to the toxin. So we're no longer using Campylobacter, we're just using the toxin. And then they developed altered wet weight. And then what's interesting is the higher the antibody, the sicker the rats were, because these antibodies are causative. They're not a marker of disease. They're the cause of the disease, we believe. But what happened to the animal's microbiome is interesting. It didn't affect stool. You can't detect this in stool microbiome testing because there's no difference between the rats in the cecum, the rats in the stool. Everything's happening in the small intestine. And this is what's going to transition to the overgrowth part of the story. When these rats got the CDTB toxin, they then ended up having an abnormal microbiome in one of two different types. Actually, three. One type is they went on the travel with the 7 friends. They didn't get sick. And they got sick, food poisoning, but they didn't get IBS after. And so they stayed the same. But there's a group that got sick, meaning IBS, and developed a cluster of elevated E. coli in their small bowel. And we know E. coli produces hydrogen. But another group of rats developed an elevation of desulfovibrio, and that's the hydrogen sulfide producer. So what's really important to understand is that there are two different types of SIBO that are going on in the rats from food poisoning. And what you'll see later is that's exactly what we see in humans. And these rats get all the stuff of IBS, all these 4 things listed here, which we've known in IBS for a long time. So how do I use this antibody testing? In my office, and I have a chronic diarrhea patient, either mixed diarrhea and constipation or diarrhea, I do the IBSsmart test. If it's positive, then I know they have IBS and it's from food poisoning. And then I can give them counsel about traveling, because every time you get food poisoning, that antibody goes higher. Every time that antibody goes higher, they're harder to treat and they're sicker. I showed you that with the rats. So we want to be able to prevent them getting worse if we know these antibodies are present. So I do it in all my patients. I don't care if they have a history of food poisoning if you look at the bottom, because they don't remember. They have diarrhea now. The first day of diarrhea could have been food poisoning. We don't know the answer to that. The only way we know the answer is by doing the test. Now I want to move on to SIBO, but the first slide I show here is this is the first study ever done. This is from our group. First study ever done in history where we sequence stool and we sequence the small intestinal microbiome in the same patients. And what you can see here is the colors represent the different categories of bacteria. It's totally different. Stool is totally different from the small bowel, and this figure made the cover of the journal because it was the first time ever this was done. So now that we know how to look at the small bowel microbiome by getting juice from the small bowel because of this study, we can start to look at SIBO and the different subtypes of SIBO, ESO and EMO, which I'll introduce to you in a moment, and be able to characterize it in IBS to bucket people. And the reason you need to bucket people is because the treatments are different. But before I get to that, I've been focusing a lot on IBS. And so when you talk about IBS and SIBO, it's an overlap. It's sort of like peptic ulcer disease and H. pylori. H. pylori does not cause all of peptic ulcer disease. It causes about 60 to 80%, which is sort of like what we're seeing here with SIBO and IBS. But then there's another 40% of IBS we don't know the cause, or it could be other things, bile acids, etc. But SIBO can be caused by anything that slows the gut down. So if you have a small bowel tumor blocking the bowel, things aren't flowing, it's like a plugged drain, you're going to get SIBO. If you have systemic disease like scleroderma or diabetic neuropathy slowing the gut down, you're going to get SIBO. So there are many things that can cause SIBO that are not just IBS, and the list is here. Now going back to SIBO and IBS a little bit, because that's your biggest cause, the most common by far. And what we find is that if you have IBS, you are more likely to be positive on breath tests. This is now conclusive with this meta-analysis from the Australian group by Ayesha Shah. And 15 of these studies are considered high quality. So it's not a low quality meta-analysis. The majority of studies are very high quality. Even by culturing the small bowel, we now know SIBO is part of IBS. This study from the Swedish group, Passerud, Iris Passerud, and then this study showing 60%. Again, the percent of IBS-D patients who have SIBO is 60%. You know, for the naysayers or people who are saying, well, breath testing is a little bit inaccurate, it actually isn't. So when we use the breath test time point of 90 minutes with the hydrogen rise of 20 using lactulose here, you can see lactulose in this part of the table. You see it's 84% specific against culture of the small bowel, but you can correlate it with the bacteria of the gut. You can negatively correlate it with the other bacteria. I'll show you what happens to the microbiome in SIBO. It goes towards this phylum and away from this phylum, which is what is seen here. But more importantly, hydrogen mechanisms, meaning the factories in the bacteria that make hydrogen, are up in SIBO IBS patients when the breath test is positive at 90 minutes. So what the breath test is actually telling you is the hydrogen producing potential of the bacteria in the small intestine, not the colon. So this basically validates the breath test. But here's the problem with breath testing. For so long, we had only hydrogen, and then methane was added to the breath test, but there's never been a breath test that actually measures all three gases. What I mean is all three gases is, this is it. There are no other gases that bacteria produce except carbon dioxide, which you make, so you can't distinguish bacteria from you. So these three gases are the main driving forces of fermentation in the gut. What we know now is that hydrogen is just the fuel for the other two pathways. And that methane, when it's produced, if you look at the bottom, you need 4 hydrogens to produce 1 methane, and that methane causes constipation. The hydrogen sulfide causes diarrhea, pain, and urgency. So it's those gases that are more important to be relatable to symptoms, and that's why you need all three. But going back to sequencing, so the other first from our group is that we were the first to ever shotgun sequence the entire small bowel, and particularly in SIBO here. So shotgun sequencing is deeper sequencing. It's basically getting to the root level. We can see exactly every piece of DNA in there, and we can also see all the way down to strain levels of bacteria, which means it's a lot more information, very complex. But look at what SIBO is. So if you're positive on culture for SIBO, SIBO is apocalyptic. Look at how different the graphs look on the right versus a non-SIBO patient. It's all about the blue here, which is proteobacteria, but Enterobacteriaceae. But it's even more cool than that. If you've ever learned about SIBO from a textbook, they say, well, it's the colon bacteria moving into the small intestine, and that's SIBO. And I'm here to tell you that is not what SIBO is. SIBO is much more specific than that, even surprised us. What we found when we went to the deepest levels is that SIBO really is composed of 2 bacteria, Kleb pneumoniae and E. coli. That's the 2 bacteria that make up SIBO. It's not all the stuff from the colon. It's just these two. So it's almost like an infection, except it's not invading you, but it's almost like an infection, which is really a surprise to us. We weren't expecting this. It even gets further bizarre because even down to the strain level, we can see that, for example, E. coli K12 correlated with the symptoms in the patients who had it to the degree that it was statistically significant for all the IBS symptoms. So could it be E. coli K12 that causes IBS? We need to do more work on this, but it's fascinating that how specific SIBO is. It really is not coliform bacteria. It's two bugs. I love this slide because it really gives an impression on you, and I hope it impresses you as it did me, of how these patients suffer. When you have this much Klebsiella and E. coli, these guys are Ferraris, and they suck up a lot of gas and they produce a lot of pollution. And what I mean by that is they are 63, if you have SIBO, you're 63 times faster at fermenting carbohydrates, especially glucose. That means you're 63 times faster producing GATs, which means you're going to bloat fast. So these patients who say, oh, I took food and 10 minutes later I'm bloated, it's possible. It's possible because these bugs are so good and fast, and they produce hydrogen. We also saw hydrogen sulfide pathways elevated and other histamine pathways as well. But all this breath test, we needed guidelines and guidance. And so in 2018, we put together the first North American consensus, which tries to piece together, how are we supposed to interpret breath tests? What's the proper way for now based on the evidence? How do you do a breath test? What's the proper way? And so we finally put a stake in the sand because some papers were saying this cutoff, some papers were saying that cutoff. You can use any cutoff you want for research as long as you tell us the cutoff that's in this paper as well so that we can compare. And so that helped sort of standardize the environment for interpretation. So now we have guidance from all across North America, most of Asia, and Europe. So one of the things that we see is there are multiple tests on the market, and I'm not here to pick on any test, but it's really important to use that North American consensus. And Gemelli is the only test that follows the consensus completely. And because that is the guidance, that is the evidence-based approach to it. And this is a study by Dr. Darren Brenner from Northwestern. Now, the TrioSmart breath test from Gemelli took a lot of work to get to it because you had to know the three gases, you had to develop and incorporate sensors for all three gases. There had to be a new state-of-the-art bag. It doesn't look state-of-the-art, it's just silver, but the material that's inside is very special to prevent the H2S from causing problems because H2S is a reactive gas. So it has to be stable. What you put in, you have to be able to detect the same amount in 8 to 10 days because you're transporting the bags through FedEx, etc. A new instrument had to be created. Then you have to do research to say, okay, is this working in real time? And then this is all established in a CLIA certified laboratory, and then allow everybody in the country to be able to do this, not just boutique academic medical centers. And what we were able to identify now is 3 subtypes: small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, the traditional overgrowth, which is hydrogen; intestinal methanogen overgrowth, and I'll explain why it's not called small intestinal. And the spoiler is methanogens are in the colon and the small bowel; and intestinal sulfide overproduction, because it's not just about the type of bacteria that are there, and there are many H2S producers, unlike the other 2 categories, and they're everywhere in the colon and the small bowel, but it's how much H2S they produce that's important. So the names reflect the physiology. Now, this is the first study in history, again, another first, where we took 2 randomized controlled trials, registered trials with the FDA. We did breath testing at the baseline of these IBS-D and IBS-C trials, and we used the 3-gas breath test. And we're able to show the differences between a diarrhea patient. We have the symptom of diarrhea or constipation. We have a 3-gas breath test, and we also did the microbiome in this study. So all 3 things were happening, which has never been done. And what we see is that when you're IBS-D, you never have methane. That's just not a thing in IBS-D. It's very rare. If you're IBS-C, about 60% of IBS-C have methane, and that's what it looks like. But D have hydrogen, and the hydrogen rises on average, not everybody, but on average, they meet the criteria for SIBO. Look at the methane group. It's lower than the other constipated group who have no methane, because when you have methane, you're eating hydrogen. So your hydrogen could be this much, but you can't see it because it's all being consumed to make methane. And this is a really important reason why you have to measure all three gases, because one gas is eating the other gas. And finally, this was the first time we show hydrogen sulfide is important in IBSD. And we went on to prove the bug. The bug in methane is Methanobrevibacter smithii. This is super interesting because it doesn't matter what time point on the breath test, the methane correlates with the quantity, the load of M. smithii in the microbiome. So not only is the breath test telling you you have methane, it tells you how many methanogens are there. And so that's really good to find. So it validates the breath test quantitatively. And what's interesting is that if you're IBS methane, your microbiome is geared up for methane production, doing metabolomics. And if you're IBSD, your microbiome is geared up for hydrogen sulfide production, which is causing diarrhea. And so like the rats I showed you earlier, remember I showed you the rats after food poisoning go into one of two microtypes. Focus on the purple and the blue because that's the food poisoning IBSD story. You get one of two microtypes, hydrogen producers, the E. coli Klebsiella, or hydrogen sulfide producers, that you can have both. I'll show you a little bit of that later, but they can go in either direction and both are abnormal. Methane, we don't know why methanes and methanogens and Methanobrevibacter go up, but they do go up in patients. It could be that you've acquired this bug early in life and it just, tends to, for different reasons and different diet, to accumulate to a level that causes symptoms. We're still trying to work that out, but it's definitely Methanobrevibacter. But people say, well, methane's not produced in the small bowel because methane needs anaerobic conditions, and that is absolutely not true. We were able to validate that TrioSmart. If you have a methane on TrioSmart, the level of methane correlates with the number of methane producers that we can detect in the juice of the small bowel. So the methanogens are in the small bowel and the colon, and the big culprit here, 63% of the group, is Methanobrevibacter smithii. That's the big culprit for methane. There are others that produce methane, but this is the big one. And methane, when you put it in the gut, you get slowing of intestinal transit every single time. And when you have methane, it's associated with constipation in this meta-analysis, and it's associated with less diarrhea on the right. Again, methane causing constipation. In this study by Stanford, they did a wireless capsule transit study. If you have methane, your small bowel is slower, your colon is slower. We did the same thing for hydrogen sulfide. The sulfate-reducing bacteria in the small intestine are elevated in proportion to the gas. So the breath test for hydrogen sulfide is telling you how much of the hydrogen sulfide bacteria are there. And in particular, here the bad actor is Proteus mirabilis. So Proteus plus other two, the higher those are, the more hydrogen sulfide on your breath. So we now have three microtypes as I get into the treatment next. We now know there's an ISO, intestinal sulfide overproduction, where in the small bowel it's Proteus, in the colon it's desulfovibrio and fuso. We know SIBO is another type of microtype, more bloating, a little less diarrhea, but still on the diarrhea side, E. coli Kleb. And Methanobrevibacter, both in the small bowel and the colon, is the major actor for methane. Methane makes constipation. I love this study, extremely complicated, but it takes every single piece of data on IBS microbiome and puts it all together. This is the Cork, Ireland group. These are the top microbiome group in the world. And they show that two things are really enriched in IBSD. It's E. coli and Fusobacterium, which is our hydrogen sulfide producer. They show the same thing we show. Then they show the effect of rifaximin, which we know is a treatment for IBS, that the reason it works is because it reduces, for one, E. coli, for another, Fusobacterium, and that the microbiome gets pushed closer to normal. It's not cratering the microbiome, rifaximin. Rifaximin is pushing the microbiome towards what a normal microbiome looks like, which is really cool because it's not really like an antibiotic we typically talk about. So how do we get our patients better? So this is the last part of my talk in the last 6 or so minutes. Rifaximin is approved by the FDA based on this paper for IBSD on the basis that part of IBSD is a microbiome problem. And now 8 years later, we sort of know what that microbiome problem is more concretely than we ever did, which is the SIBO part of it. But even then, we knew that if you took rifaximin without thinking, 44% of people would respond. But if you knew they had SIBO by breath test, it jumps to 56%. And if those that are positive became negative after rifaximin, the response rate to rifaximin goes up to 76%. So the breath test is telling you who's going to respond. And look, rifaximin for SIBO, there's a meta-analysis on it. Rifaximin works for SIBO, almost no negative studies. It's pretty conclusive here. Methane positive patients, this is the patients with constipation. Rifaximin by itself doesn't work well. Neomycin, as you can see here, by itself doesn't work well. But we learned in vitro in the lab that if you combine these two for some reason, they create a special ability to kill the methanogens, and you get a better outcome for methane and constipation. So this is a much lower constipation severity after getting both of these, and much lower methane. For hydrogen sulfide, we have stuff coming. I'll sort of tease you with that. But we use bismuth because this study shows that if you took Pepto-Bismol, you get more reduction in hydrogen sulfide organisms. So I'll show you how we use that. So the way I use it in my practice is when I do the breath test, let's start at the bottom or the middle. If I see bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, I use rifaximin. We now have a new elemental company formulated so that we can get something that people can actually take. Elemental diet works this way. It gives you food, and the bacteria don't get the food because it's all ready to absorb. It's all elemental. And if you do that for 2 weeks, you're able to get rid of about 75% of EMO and almost universally SIBO, even in those where rifaximin didn't work. So it's an option, a little tougher. You got to pay cash for it because it's sold in the open market. If you have intestinal sulfide overproduction, I use rifaximin and Pepto-Bismol. And if you have methanogens, I use rifaximin and neomycin based on the one study. My experience tells me that rifaximin and metronidazole works just as well as neomycin and rifaximin. And then, of course, the elemental diet. But stay tuned because we have a drug going into clinical trials just in a few weeks that we already have done human studies. We're now in phase 2B that really improve upon our ability to get rid of intestinal sulfide and SIBO. And then we have a novel agent for antivinculin, which I'll describe sometime later this year, and a drug that blocks methane. See a lot of this new stuff in the coming year or two. And then finally, if you have a positive antivinculin or if the patient recurs, this is a study we did way back in 2009 using Prokinetics. So if you treat overgrowth in patients who relapse, let's take the patients who relapse, then they generally relapse if you don't do anything in about 60 days on average, but it varies. If you gave them the prokinetic erythromycin at night, 50 milligrams, 60 milligrams, you're going to get a prolongation of remission. But if you gave the serotonin agonist, tegaserod, we now use prucalopride for this purpose, you can get them almost 2/3 of a year or even up to a year of preventing the need for rifaximin again, so which is why we use Prokinetics. And even in DIBS, look, in DIBS, we're giving a Prokinetic, but we already got rid of their SIBO. They don't have diarrhea now, and we're using it at night to trigger the cleaning waves that are deficient. This is super critical because for the first time in IBS history, with the luxury of a lot of the modern science and data that I've showed you today, this guideline from the Indian consensus states that IBS-D and SIBO are related, grade A recommendation. That methane slows the gut transit and is associated with constipation, level 1 evidence and grade B recommendation. And that food poisoning is important in the development of IBS, grade A recommendation. So the world of IBS is changing based on what I showed you today. So in conclusion, IBS is a disease because you have a diagnostic test that says it's a disease. It's not a syndrome. Food poisoning is the cause of that disease. IBSsmart can diagnose and risk stratify IBS-D for you. And now TrioSmart is the most validated breath test in history. Never has a breath test been compared to the small bowel aspirates to be able to show that it is as accurate as can be in terms of comparing to the microbiome. This is not your grandpa's SIBO because there's some data, people who suggest that SIBO has to be malabsorption and this and that from the 1960s. That is not true, and we're way past that. Small bowel microbiome is bearing fruit. We are now able to construct new treatments, which you will hear, because we know the three gases and we know the microbiome players that make those gases, and we can attack them directly. So stay tuned for new therapies.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.